what we felt was a very positive and productive engagement yesterday with President Putin and Special Envoy Witkoff. Obviously, he is on his way back. He should be back, and hopefully we'll convene this weekend. We'll examine the Russian position more closely and determine, the President will then determine what the next steps are. Suffice it to say, I think there is reason to be cautiously optimistic. But by the same token, we continue to recognize this is a difficult and complex situation. It will not be easy, it will not be simple. But we certainly feel like we're at least some steps closer to ending this war and bringing peace, but it's still a long journey. It's a journey of many steps. But this is positive momentum. Obviously, we'll see what Russia and others are willing to do. It's not just Russia. Obviously, it has to be things acceptable to Ukraine. But it's been a good week in that front, but there's a lot of work that remains to be done. But, there's reason to be cautiously and optimistic, but we'll know more once Special Envoy Witkoff, Ambassador Witkoff returns, and we have a chance to all convene and talk about it. And obviously, the President is the ultimate decider on next steps for the United States. Okay.
Mr. Secretary, do you trust Putin?
I think it's an irrelevant question. I think in foreign policy, it's not about trusting, it's about action. It's about things that you do. So in the end, on something like this, you can't just say you want peace, you have to do peace. And that's true for both sides in any conflict. So in any war or in any engagement. So I think ultimately, all these things, I would just encourage you guys, if we're going to be serious about foreign policy, to sort of navigate away from some of this is not a reality show, this is not about personalities, this is very simple. You either do things or you don't. There are things you are doing and things you're not doing. And that's what foreign policy is driven by, and that's how our decisions should be driven by. So unfortunately, in foreign policy, oftentimes you will have to work with, I'm not talking about President Putin in particular, I'm talking about generally, you will have to work with people you don't like in foreign policy. And oftentimes you will have disagreements with people you like. Sometimes you will have to figure out how to work together with nations that are not aligned with you on most issues. And in some other cases, you may find yourself unaligned on an issue with a nation that you work with very closely on a bunch of other things. That's not just now true today. That has been true throughout the history of mankind and certainly the relations between nation states. So I think it's important. I get there's this temptation to cover foreign policy the way we cover domestic policy and the way we cover other things in our society. But foreign policy is about nation states pursuing what they have interpreted to be in their national interests. And balancing that is what the art of diplomacy and the work of foreign policy is all about. And so we need to sort of be mature and open-eyed and realistic without losing our idealism, without losing, what we hope the world will look like and want to shape it and be a part of. But by the same token, we have to make pragmatic decisions every single day, and that's not true today. That's always been true. Always.
Secretary, do you have any top lines from Mr. Witkoff? This was a late meeting. It went hours long. Is there anything that he shared? And then when you do examine the Russian position, that the comments by President Putin were quite convoluted and tough to decipher. I wonder if you think that he's playing for time.
Well, I think you're not going to. This is not something that's going to play out in press conferences. As I stand at a press conference. But this is, these, again, I go back to the point I just made. When you want, if you think about the most recent example of ceasefire negotiations, which was what happened in Gaza and with Israel and so forth, yeah, there were newspaper and there were articles and there was news stories about it, but ultimately you found out what the results were after the fact. And in the meantime, you saw public statements from different sides in regards to what they were going to do. I think this will be no different. So certainly, we're not going to make our foreign policy decisions on the basis of what a leader simply says at a press conference or somebody puts up on a social media post because you're some blogger close to the Kremlin or something like that. And likewise, I don't think they're going to do that either. So I would just say that this is going to play out the way things of this nature and caliber have traditionally and normally play out, and that is with the leaders of the countries involved speaking, not in front of the cameras, not in front of the media, but in these negotiations that happen and in these talks that happen. So I'm not going to comment on what President Putin said, other than he said he agreed with it in concept. So,
with lots of reservations.
Well, again, he said that at a press conference. As I said, and I go back to the phrase I used earlier, I think there is reason for cautious optimism that something good could come of this. Obviously, we're going to wait for Ambassador Witkoff to return. He's not back yet. We're going to reconvene. Obviously, I spoke to him late last night. He spoke to the president well before that. You may have spoken to other members of our team. I've been here, but ultimately, we're going to reconvene, and the president will have options available to him, and decisions will be made after that. But I don't want to speculate or characterize anything beyond what I've just said until we have had a chance to sit down with Ambassador Woodcock, who's still overseas and in travel.
Can I just follow up on that point then, Mr. Secretary, because when on the way here, you said you were seeking an unconditional acceptance. I mean, clearly Mr. Putin is adding a whole series of conditions, and also the president says this should be...
Well, how do you know he's adding conditions?
From what he said publicly. Yeah.
Well, I go back to the point I made. Let's let this thing play through, okay? And then let's figure out what... Let me at least talk to... Let's the team get together on the state side of this and talk to Ambassador Woodcock and go through some of this. Again, we're not going to be involved in this process where I'm being asked to stake a position of U.S. policy on the basis of what someone said at a press conference yesterday. So we're going to work through this thing in a normal, sane fashion. We'll figure out where we are based on what I know at this moment with my conversation with Ambassador Woodcock. He's not here yet. I feel like there's reason for cautious optimism. I think the president shared that today in his True Social post. But there's a lot of work. No, I have never told anybody that this is going to be easy, fast, simple, slam dunk. It'll be hard, but it's important work. We are a better place today, I hope, I believe, we have reason to believe, than we were a week ago. But we still have a long ways to go. It could come together pretty quickly if everyone aligns, but I don't know how aligned we are yet. That's what we're about to find out. So cautious optimism is about the best phraseology I could use at this moment. Based on what we know, we're going to keep working on it.
Secretary, the statement that you...
I'll get to everybody.
But it's just the fundamental element of the president's proposal was it should be an immediate ceasefire.
Sure, and that's the
question is,
proposal.
how long does Putin have?
Well, in terms of long for what?
How long does because there are those who say he's playing for time, but this is adding conditions, adding...
Well, this war's been going on for 3 years. So I think the question, and with no end in sight at this point, without this intervention by President Trump. So I think the question is, is the fundamental question really is not how long. I think the question is, are we actually moving towards a ceasefire, or is this a delay tactic? I'm not going to answer that because I can't characterize that for you right now. I think we'll know sooner rather than later, and a lot of that will be based on the conversation Ambassador Woodcock had yesterday and other factors that are in play. But we're not there yet, but we will get there. We want it to be, the president wanted it to be yesterday and the day before. But we're certainly at least talking about peace for the first time in 3 years. Now we'll have to figure out how close we truly are, and that's going to take some time. And Woodcock's not here yet, so here meaning stateside.
Mr. Secretary, the joint statement says that there is a need for robust and credible security arrangements for Ukraine. How would you define that based on your conversations here at the G7? What are robust and credible security arrangements?
Well, that's to be determined by the negotiations. Here's what I want to encourage everybody to do. Bifurcate two things, okay? The ceasefire and the conditions for everybody to stop shooting at each other. What will it take to get everybody to stop shooting at each other? And then moving to a negotiating table on settling the war with finality. Two separate processes. Process number one is, what do we need from both sides in order to stop the shooting and the fighting, so that you can get to a negotiating table? That's the second phase. As part of that second phase, there will obviously be every country in the world has a right to security, has a right to defend itself, has a right to protect its territory. That will have to be part of that conversation. And it will have to be something that involves not simply the views of the United States, but other countries that are involved in that. I've repeated this over and over again. The European Union has imposed significant sanctions on the Russian Federation and on individuals inside of Russia. So they will have to be consulted and they'll have to be engaged in this process and so forth. So let's not predetermine or start putting everything ahead of itself here. The process of what long-term security means for Ukraine, that will be something that Ukraine will obviously have to agree with, and that will have to be worked through as part of that second phase. But we can't get to the second phase till we get through the first phase. We think it's very difficult to negotiate lasting peace and security in the midst of a all-out war. And so we have to try to lower that so that it makes it possible to move to phase two of this.
Secretary, the statement that you issued a little while ago also notes that the G7 discussed ways to impose costs on Russia should that become necessary, to include caps on oil prices, additional support for Ukraine using seized sovereign Russian assets. Was there, but it said it discussed them, you didn't agree on them. Is there any agreement within the G7 on these particular measures? Just what they should be in what order and what might trigger them? And why did you discuss them if you're so cautiously optimistic?
Well, first of all, they were raised because the Europeans have their own set of sanctions and new ones they would like to impose. And certainly the United States is not a member of the EU. We don't have a vote at the EU. And so whatever they determine and decide to do, we can't control it. They ask us for our input, we'll give it to them, but that's not what's happening right now. So yes, it was discussed. As far as U.S. sanctions are concerned, the president's made clear, the president on 2 occasions in the past week has reminded everybody that the U.S. has these options available to it, but he doesn't want to do that right now because he's in the hopes of attracting people, both sides, to a process where we can negotiate peace. And I'll leave it at that. There really is nothing to add to that at this point.
Mr. Secretary,
Go ahead. Hold on one second. Yes.
Statement reaffirmed unwavering support for Ukraine's territorial integrity, which has been largely absent in various U.S. statements since January 20th. What led you to subscribe to this time?
But that's not a change in public policy. The United States have never said that Russia, I've never heard President Trump say that Russia has a right to take all of Ukraine and do whatever they want there. So that's not inconsistent with that statement. That is separate from the issue we face today. And that is that as it stands today, there is a war going on that has no military solution to it. Neither Russia nor Ukraine can achieve its maximalist military aims. The only way to end this war is through a process of negotiations. Negotiations, be it in business, in commerce, or in geopolitics, involves both sides giving something, both sides making concessions. That's just obvious. I'm not saying, I don't think that should be sort of a news-making statement. That's the reality of any conversations that exist in order to end wars, is that there has to be some level of concessions. What those concessions are remains to be seen. That'll have to be part of the negotiation. But it's not going to be helpful to enter into those negotiations making blanket statements that may give an excuse for one side or the other not to participate in it. So we'll have to get to that stage where these things are discussed, and ultimately both sides, whatever happens, both sides will have to agree to it. And that's true of any negotiation when you're trying to end a war.